Right, well, those of you who were here last week will remember that Mike gave us a very helpful introduction to the book of Daniel, and that's one of the series we're now starting on. And so this is the second sermon in that series, and we're looking this morning at Daniel chapter 1. So if you have your Bibles with you, we'll just read the passage in question. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the articles from the temple of God. These he carried off to the temple of his God in Babylonia, and put in the treasure house of his God. Then the king ordered Ashpenaz, chief of his court officials, to bring in some of the Israelites from the royal family and the nobility, young men without any physical defect, handsome, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well-informed, quick to understand, and qualified to serve in the king's palace. He was to teach them the language and literature of the Babylonians. The king assigned them a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table. They were to be trained for 3 years, and after that they were to enter the king's service. Among these were some from Judah: Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. The chief official gave new names. To Daniel the name Belteshazzar, to Hananiah Shadrach, to Mishael Meshach, and to Azariah Abednego. But Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine, and he asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself in this way. Now God had caused the official to show favour and sympathy to Daniel, but the official told Daniel, "I'm afraid of my lord the king, who has assigned your food and drink. Why should he see you looking worse than the other young men of your age? The king would then have my head because of you." Daniel then said to the guard, whom the chief official had appointed over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, "Please test your servants for 10 days. Give us nothing but vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then compare our appearance with that of the young men who eat the royal food, and treat your servants in accordance with what you see." So he agreed to this and tested them for 10 days. At the end of the 10 days, they looked healthier and better nourished than any of the young men who ate the royal food. So the guard took away their choice food and the wine they were to drink, and gave them vegetables instead. To these 4 young men, God gave knowledge and understanding of all kinds of literature and learning, and Daniel could understand visions and dreams of all kinds. At the end of the time set by the king to bring them in, the chief official presented them to Nebuchadnezzar. The king talked with them, and he found none equal to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, so they entered the king's service. In every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king questioned them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters in his whole kingdom. And Daniel remained there until the 1st year of King Cyrus. Let's just pray. Father, as we look at this passage from your word this morning, we just pray that you will open our hearts and our understanding, and Lord, that you will teach us what you want to say to us through it. In Jesus' name, amen. Right, so as we heard last week, Daniel was taken away captive to Babylon with the first lot of people who were deported from Judah. Nebuchadnezzar came to Judah 3 times and took away 3 lots of people. The 3rd time he actually destroyed the whole place, destroyed the temple, and only left a remnant of the halt, the lame and the blind behind. But this first deportation, he took the royal people and the nobility, the kind of the cream, the elite of their society. And Daniel was among these. And so that's the background that we're in. It's sort of quite soon after Nebuchadnezzar has really got his kingdom established, his empire established. And part of Nebuchadnezzar's plan for consolidating his empire and strengthening it was this business of deporting whole rafts of people away from their native land into Babylon. The idea being partly that that meant that the territories left behind didn't have the leaders and the skilled people, the people who could build the economy, the people who could govern, the people who could stir up rebellion. They were all taken away. So that was one way that he was just making sure that his empire was consolidated. The other bit, of course, was he was taking all the people who got the skills and the gifts and the abilities and who were a great advantage to their, to any kingdom. Thought he would like to harness their talents for Babylon. And again, part of his key strategy, if you want to establish a big empire, one thing you do need to stamp out is the sort of individual national identities, people having loyalties to their old nations and kingdoms. What you want is to kind of bring them all into a great big amorphous thing and get their loyalty to be to that. So, Nebuchadnezzar has this very clever plan. He says to the chief of his court officials, that's the translation in the NIV. If you look at some other translations, you'll find that word more literally translated is the chief of the eunuchs. We'll come back to that later. But he says to him, right, I want you to train up some of the real choice young people. And, of course, the young men from Judah are among these. Train them up to make them useful for the Babylonians. I want you to make them into Babylonians and bring their gifts here. So you can see his logic, and having done all the sort of conquering and everything, he now wants to build a good new society. He's probably got some quite good intentions among that, as well as the obviously selfish ones. But as Mike pointed out to us last week, the issue for God's people is rather difficult, because now they're living under Babylonian rule in Babylon, but they are actually citizens of Judah. They are part of the people of God. And the danger point is, how do we live in Babylon while not losing our identity and our calling and our purpose as the people of God? In other words, how do we live in Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom and still be, first and foremost, God's people? For them, it was absolutely imperative that they did not lose their national identity, because that is actually who they are and who God's called them to be. And actually, at this point, you can see where the temptation would be, because they're not actually in Babylon living under severe persecution. And in fact, for the godly among them, they have also had the teaching of the prophets, notably Jeremiah, and Mike read to us Jeremiah's letter to the exiles last week, the letter which told them it's not going to be a short time in Babylon, it's going to be a long time. You are to settle down, you're to build houses, you're to establish yourselves there, you're to grow in number, you're to bless the place where you're living, and actually you're to pray for the prosperity of these people who have carried you off into exile. It's quite a big challenge. But of course the danger point is, how do you do that without getting assimilated into the culture of this new kingdom, which of course is very much at odds with the culture of the kingdom of God. So here we have these 4 young men. It's strange, isn't it? They all got new names, but we all know Daniel as Daniel, and most of us know Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. But they're all young men who have taken on board this, how do we live in a foreign land as God's people? How do we maintain our loyalty there without actually antagonising the people among whom we must live, and not disobeying God's instruction to us to bless and seek their prosperity? So, this first chapter tells us all about how they set about doing this, and in particular, Daniel is the kind of the key player here. So here they are, they're in Nebuchadnezzar's special university. They've been given new Babylonian names. That's one of the things that's beyond their control. Some things are beyond their control. They do not have an option about living in Babylon. Although they're not being persecuted as such, they are captives. They don't have the option of returning home. That's beyond their control. But they also know, because they're young men who've obviously been very much involved in hearing the prophet's message, they also know that actually it's God who's done this. Now that's quite a challenge to people who had assumed that being God's people meant, you know, we're immune, we can do what we like and we're okay. This has been a big challenge. They've had to rethink their theology. They've had to rethink how they live out God's purpose. They've had to take on board the fact that they're actually under God's judgment. But they also have to trust, okay, God is in charge. They have been told by Jeremiah not only that it will be a long time, so settle down, but also that it won't be permanent. You will be coming back. So it's important that you maintain that walk with God. You maintain your identity, because you will be coming back to your own land as the people you are, as the nation you are, for the purposes of God. You must preserve that. So yes, here they are. That's beyond their control. They have to trust God with that. When it comes to being given new names, again, there's not a lot they can do about it. It gives us a very clear idea of Nebuchadnezzar's agenda here, because of course your name is your identity. And these young men, well, Daniel's name meant God, as in Yahweh, our God, is my judge. Hananiah means the Lord shows grace. Mishael, who is what God is. And Azariah, the Lord helps me. And these new names actually have the Babylonian gods in them. Bel or Marduk is the chief Babylonian god. Aku, Nabu. So we've actually got Belteshazzar, Shadrach and Meshach, named after Aku, and Abud-Nego, Nebo. That's again the Babylonian god that's there in their names. So it's like he's saying, you are now the property of these gods. You're now to have loyalty to them. They're going to be the ones that help you and govern your destiny. They can't do a lot about what other people call them. Perhaps it's one of the first principles we all have to get hold of when it comes to how you live under an alien culture, is that you can't do anything about what other people do. That is not in your control. You have to live with that. But one thing that they were very determined about was that these new names were not going to define them. They remained the men they were. They remained citizens of Judah, people of God, who were prepared to allow his kingship to be what ruled their lives. But then the other thing, of course, is that now they're being offered a great opportunity. As I said, if you consider that actually this Ashpenaz, his title is actually chief of the eunuchs, most of the court officials in places like Babylon were eunuchs. We are not told specifically whether that's what happened to these young men, but it could have done. Way back in Isaiah's day, when Hezekiah greeted some envoys from Babylon and showed them everything in his palace and kingdom and temple and all the rest of it, and Isaiah came to him and said, what did you show those people? He said, I showed them everything I got. And he said, actually, that was a bad thing to do. He said, one day the king of Babylon will come here and will take all that to Babylon, and your descendants will become eunuchs who serve the king of Babylon. It might be that even that has happened to them. Again, if so, it's beyond their control. And we don't even hear it mentioned, but it's a possibility. So for these young men, they are in a situation they would never choose. But they are in that saying, okay, Lord, you're in charge. I don't understand, I don't like, but I will be faithful to you and I'll trust you through this. But then, comes the difficult issue for them. The king, apparently, probably thinks this is a real privilege, is giving to all these select young men special royal food from his own table. None of your sort of peasant diet for them. They're getting the same food the king gets, the same wine the king gets. Wow, what a privilege. And I would guess that large numbers of the people enlisted in this project thought, well, we're into a good thing here. And then, you know, there's the prospect of a really good career at the end of it, of position and status. So you can see it's quite an attractive offer. Problem, the king's food, prior to being served to the king, is offered to the idol. Same with the wine, the libation is poured out to the idol. Furthermore, the Babylonians don't have the same laws about how you prepare your food, how you slaughter the animals, how you prepare the food so that there's no blood in it, because blood is sacred to the Lord, it's the life. That's the thinking behind that particular ceremony. And of course they are under the law of Moses, and the ceremonial law still applies. This is not New Testament times, this is Old Testament times. The ceremonial law also still applies. It hasn't yet been transcended in Christ. So for these young men to eat that food, the meat that the king eats and the wine that the king drinks, as far as they're concerned, that would be to pollute themselves. Not because there's some sort of evil magic in the food itself, but because that represents something, just as their Jewish diet and regulations represent something of your dedication to God, of the fact that you're obeying him. So it's a problem. It might seem a small issue, but as we'll see, small issues can sometimes represent very big issues. Just think of the furore that gets stirred up when somebody wears a little emblem, or puts on a certain garment, or waves a certain flag that displays an allegiance to something that the surrounding culture considers to be not acceptable. Does it really matter what jewellery you wear, what headgear you wear, what flag you wave? Those things in themselves don't seem important, but what they represent is important. And that's why they matter. And for Daniel, we read, Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine. The older translation says he purposed in his heart. So before dealing with the issue, before knowing how I'm going to approach it, he has already decided, I am going to maintain my integrity here, because this one is in his control. Nobody can force you to eat something. They can call you what they like, they can do other things to you, they can carry you away captive, but actually they cannot make you pick up the food and eat it. It's the thing one of those principles you learn when dealing with people. You can't make anybody do anything, but they can't make you do anything either. That is in your control. And so here is an issue where actually they have to make the decision. But it's interesting how Daniel handles it. Although what I'm about to say might sound like he was sort of hoping he could possibly do this, actually he's, whatever happens, he's not going to give way. But he doesn't go, right, that's it, I am not doing this, you pagan people are not making me eat this food. He didn't do that. He didn't insult the king. He goes to an official with whom he's already got a good relationship. He says, actually, this guy is really impressed with Daniel. So he's not been trying to antagonise people or stir up trouble. He goes to somebody who's already favourably disposed to him and says, do you mind if I don't eat the king's food, please? Because actually, I'm a Jew and that's defiling for us. So, please, can we be excused? And the official probably was sympathetic to him, but of course, he knows what Nebuchadnezzar's like, and we'll see more of that later. Not somebody you want to get on the wrong side of if you can help it. It's more than my head's worth. But he seems to have been pretty quiet when Daniel then went to the person under him who actually had to serve the food and said, could you just give us vegetables, please, and take away the royal food? But I tell you what, so you don't need to worry about consequences for you, let's have a 10-day trial. That's long enough for you to begin to see the effects, but not so long that if actually we do begin to look like emaciated skeletons, you can't change it all. So he says, oh, okay. So there's just this quiet trial going on. He's not making a big public statement. He hasn't told the king. This is not his witness to being a person of God or anything like that. This is about his private relationship with God, and he's not compromising. And see how the Lord opens the way, makes it possible, and actually honours him. Wow, these young men actually look even more sort of healthy and handsome than all the ones who've been eating the royal dainties. Maybe the royal dainties weren't that healthy. It's quite possible. But it's all right. So the official can then take away their food and wine. Now notice it's still coming from the royal table. Good news for the official, isn't it? Oh, I can take it away. I bet that official got nice and fat. But God has honoured Daniel and his friends. And when the time comes for Nebuchadnezzar to actually check them out, he finds, actually, these guys, they're really the cream of the crop. I'm going to have these in my court. And so actually God has honoured them and opened the way for them because they stood firm in this apparently quite small private issue of their relationship with God. Why should something so small be so important? I mean, we can all see the point when we get to the next chapter and they're being asked to bow down to an idol, why they sort of say, sorry, can't do it. We can see the point when it's Daniel, actually, you know, you're going in the lion's den if you don't stop praying to that God of yours. That's different. We all know, when it comes to the big issue, we all know what the right answer is. The question is, you know, having the courage to do it, but we all know what's the right. I mean, when somebody puts the gun to your head and says, recant or die, we all know the right thing to do is to die. It's quite clear cut, you know, there's no question about what's the faithful answer here. But in this small thing, well, is this a grey area? I'll tell you a personal illustration of this one. When I was 20, in my summer break after my second year at university, part of my course was that you had to spend 6 weeks of your summer break on a placement. And that particular summer I was in a placement at Norwich Social Services Department, which was quite a big department in those days, don't know what it's like now, but yeah, so there were lots of social workers there, all ages, all types, all sorts of personalities, quite a mixed bag. And, you know, I was quite enjoying the placement. Then one day at lunchtime, I think somebody was leaving or retiring or something like that. But anyway, they had brought in some bottles of wine or sherry or something of that sort. And there's going to be a sort of farewell do for them. And we thought, oh, you know, at lunchtime there's a farewell do for this person. So, oh, that's fine. Now, here was I was a young Salvationist. And as most of you know, one of the things you had signed to was that I would abstain from the use of all intoxicating liquor. So I was under that vow. That had never been an issue for me. I do know some Salvationists who kind of made it the whole substance of their testimony, but actually that was not an issue for me. I just asked for the lemonade or the orange juice. Had never been a problem. But on this occasion, it was the first and the only time in my life I've ever found myself in a rather embarrassing situation, because this was a sort of tribute to this person. We're all there, supposed to be, you know, toasting them and everything. But nobody had provided anything non-alcoholic. We weren't in a bar or anything where you could go and get something. There was only these bottles that they brought in. And I thought, oh dear, that's going to be awkward. I said, I'm sorry, I can't have any. And I said, oh, well, you know, it's all right. And strangely enough, there was an older woman in the department who was also a Salvationist. And she said to me, oh, well, she said, I know it's awkward. She said, I used to just stand there with them and sort of, you know, tend to sip it a bit. I said, I can't do it. So it was the only time I've ever felt awkward and embarrassed in that sort of social situation. But I couldn't in good conscience do it, you see, because I knew I'd signed this vow before God. interestingly, a couple of weeks later, I came into the office in the morning and saw more bottles on the side. I thought, uh-oh. And yes, there was going to be another, so I thought, right, I'll just slip out at lunchtime and not sort of make a fuss, you know, because people had noticed, you see, and I felt embarrassed and people commented. But then, strangely enough, as I was going to my desk, another chap came over to me and he says, by the way, he says, I know it was difficult for you. He says, I bought you a bottle of fruit juice, one of these Schweppes bottles, some sort of fruit juice. I brought this for you. And this time the other Salvationist shared it with me. Now, you might think, what a small thing. If you want to seduce somebody, do you start by raping them? Or do you, to use the modern day parlance, do you start grooming them first? You come in with something small, subtle, not that big. You know, you don't walk up and ask for the sort of what your ultimate aim is. You know, just be a little more subtle, gentle, you know, put it in the thin end of the wedge, then you can push it a bit further. That's how Satan works. If he wants to get us under his control, he doesn't usually come out with all guns blazing saying, deny Jesus or here's the consequence. Because that's a bit obvious. And probably most of us in that situation do know what we need to do. But actually, well, come on, you know, you're supposed to be fitting in here. You don't want to offend the king, do you? You could jeopardise your chances of your career here. And actually, you might even find yourself getting some of the persecution you thought you might get when you came here. You know, it doesn't matter. And I'll bet a lot of those young men from Judah thought just like that. Because it's not the big stakes. But I'm certain that had they capitulated here, the story when it came to the fiery furnace or the den of lions might have been different. But the key thing for Daniel is he had made his decision as to where his loyalty lay and to whom he would give obedience. Before any crisis arose, he had already made up his mind, I will not defile myself. I will stand faithful before my God. I will do what he says. And in this small issue, he said, no, that's what I'm going to do. It's only a small thing, but I will do it. And when the day came that it's actually a pride of lions he's facing, he says, no, I'm still doing it. We notice for Jesus that, you know, when Satan first approached him, it was a bit more subtle. He didn't start with the bow down before me. He starts with something, oh, it sounds quite reasonable. That would be okay. You know, no, that would be all right for you to do. But then when the stakes go up, you've already lowered the barrier, as it were. And I believe we can learn a lot from Daniel here as to how we live in what is an alien culture, and it is increasingly alien. When Jesus told the parable of the wheat and the tares, he said, you know, the wheat and the tares will grow together until the harvest. In other words, they will both be getting bigger. It's not that the wheat will somehow obliterate the tares, or that the tares will obliterate the wheat. They will both grow till the harvest. They will both grow stronger. They will both grow more mature. And as the light increases, so will the darkness. And as the darkness increases, so will the light. We need to hang on to that. But the stakes will go up, and we need to face that. Many of our brothers and sisters around the world are facing that in a big way already. The stakes are very high for staying true to the Word of God in many, many countries today. They're getting higher here. And you will notice that Satan, as with Daniel and he didn't start with saying, bow down to the Babylonian idols. He starts with something that seems not the key issue, not the thing that you really want to be what you're known for, but it's the thing that the equivalent of their journalist in those days will back you into the corner to make you speak on. I think we need to be aware that, you know, as we continue in these last days, however long the last days may be, scripturally speaking, we are in them until Jesus returns again. The stakes may get higher for us. They almost certainly will get higher for us. If we are going to be able to stand when things get tougher, we need to be able to stand when things are not so tough. We're not yet at the stage, where it's actually illegal to be a Christian in this country. That could come. For Daniel and his friends, it possibly meant losing a bit of their good prospects. 3 to 4 centuries later, when a guy called Antiochus Epiphanes was ruling the region under the Greek Empire, it became a capital offence to stick to the Jewish diet. They were so determined to stamp out Judaism, and he dedicated their rebuilt temple to his God and sacrificed pig's flesh on the altar. He was determined to stamp them out. It was a much higher stake. And for those people to say, no, we're going to eat kosher food, was actually to say, I will sacrifice my life rather than my identity as a person of God. So yes, for Daniel and his wife, this was not a big deal, but it was a big deal because it's where the decision was made. And I suppose that's really what I'm saying today is when we're in our present circumstance, we don't need to court persecution. We don't need to make a point of trying to kind of draw attention to ourselves and cause unnecessary confrontation and aggravation. Paul says, insofar as it lies in you, live at peace with all men. In other words, don't be the ones that start the confrontations. As far as you're able to, be at peace with people. And you see how Daniel was like that. He didn't get rude or aggressive. He was polite. He sought to sort of persuade. And we'll see later, he continued to be a person who was very tactful and diplomatic. But don't compromise either. And when they back you into the corner, and actually it really does become a case of, well, I've either got to please them or please God. I will have to please God. I was mentioning it to Clive earlier in the week. When I was a child in junior school, I think I may have mentioned this hymn before. It was a hymn we used to sing when I was in the junior school. By the time I got to the sixth form, it had kind of dropped into disuse. By G.K. Chesterton, O God of earth and altar, bow down and hear our cry. Do you know that one? Our earthly rulers falter, our people drift and die. The walls of gold entomb us, and the swords of scorn divide. Take not thy thunder from us, but take away our pride. And the second verse, and I was 7 when I started learning to sing this one, from all that terror teaches, from lies of tongue and pen, from all the easy speeches that comfort cruel men, from sale and profanation of honour and the sword, from sleep and from damnation, deliver us, good Lord. Funny, they don't sing that in primary schools nowadays, do they? I loved it. That's why I can remember the words. It was a really good hymn. But that's the thing. At the bottom line, they would not be Babylonianized. They were not prepared to be no longer citizens of Judah, but citizens of this big emerging Babylonian empire, which was going to sort of, bring its culture and all its benefits and economic advantages to the world. They were not prepared to do that because they knew who they were, even if they'd been given these Babylonian name tags. They were not those men. They were the men they were before God. And for us too, in our relatively easy time at the moment, I say it's getting tougher, but it's relatively still easy when you look at what others are through, we need to be aware that now is the time to decide whom we will serve. Don't wait for the crisis. Don't wait for the time when it's suddenly, I've got to make it now. You can't be the sort of person who just makes those decisions on impulse. You need to be people who have said, this is it. This is the way I'm going. And nothing and nobody is going to turn me around. And that's why Daniel became the man he became later. At this point, he's only a young man, probably even younger than I was at 20. But by the time he's a very old man, he's seen this empire fall and another one emerging, and God's promises beginning to be fulfilled for his own people. And that's what we need to hang on to ourselves as well. He's coming back. He is king. Caesar is not.